Welcome to Creepy Campfire Tales, where the world of the unexplained, the mysterious, and the terrifying comes to life. We dive into haunted places, ghostly encounters, and chilling folklore that will make you question what lurks in the shadows. Each story is carefully crafted to pull you into the unknown, whether it's supernatural legends, real-life mysteries, or urban myths. There's always a tale waiting to send shivers down your spine. And the best part? You're never alone. You're part of our community of brave souls, always ready for one more terrifying story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Welcome to Creepy Campfire Tales, where every fire holds a dark secret. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool night air. A group of 6 campers hurtled around the blaze, faces bathed in its warm glow, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and unease. The forest surrounding them was silent, too silent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. "It's just a story," Ethan said, his voice betraying his nerves. He poked at the fire, trying to keep the flames alive. "Right, Taylor?" Taylor smirked, leaning back against a log. "Maybe, but then again, legends like this one always start with a bit of a truth." Samantha, the youngest of the group, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Tell it already," she whispered. "I just want to get it over with." Taylor's eyes glinted in the firelight as he begun. "This forest wasn't always quiet. Years ago, before any of us were born, people would hear strange voices calling from the trees. They said it was the forest itself echoing their names, beckoning them deeper. Some listened to those voices, and they never came back." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. The fire dimmed for a moment, casting shadows that seemed to dance at the edges of the campsite. "No one knew where the voices came from," Taylor continued, his tone dropping lower. "But one night, a group of campers just like us decided to follow them. They were never seen again. Some say the forest claimed them, and their souls now wander these woods, calling out for someone to join them." A branch snapped in the distance. Everyone froze, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "Did you hear that?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just an animal," Ethan said, but his words lacked conviction. Taylor grinned. "Maybe, or maybe it's the voices." Suddenly a faint sound echoed from the trees. At first it was barely a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice. No, several voices calling out from the darkness. "Ethan?" The group went dead silent. The voice was soft, chilling, as if carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. It called his name. Ethan stood, his eyes wide with terror. "Stop messing with me," he snapped. "Who's doing that?" But no one responded. The voice came again, this time clearer. "Ethan, come." His friends stared at him, frozen in fear. The voice wasn't any of them. It was coming from the forest. "I'm not falling for this," Ethan muttered, backing away from the trees. "This isn't funny." But the voice grew louder, now calling all their names in a soft, eerie unison. "Samantha, Taylor, Ethan." They all stood, now panic settling in. The fire flickered wildly, as if the air around them had grown colder. "We should leave," said Lily, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." Just as they turned to grab their things, the voices grew louder, more insistent. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying their names like a haunting melody. Suddenly Ethan screamed. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the ground. The others rushed to him, but as they touched him, they realized in horror his skin was ice cold. The voices stopped. The fire died down to a mere glow, casting long, twisted shadows across Ethan's lifeless body. "Ethan," Taylor knelt beside him, shaking him, but there was no response. His chest wasn't moving. Before anyone could react, the forest erupted with sounds, whispers, cries, and faint ghastly laughter. The trees seemed to bend inward, the shadows creeping closer. Samantha, her voice shaking, shouted, "We have to run now." They scrambled to their feet, leaving the campsite behind. As they sprinted through the dark, twisted forest, the voices followed, growing louder, more louder with each passing second. Behind them, the fire finally went out. As they ran, the echoes of the forest grew clearer, more distinct. Each voice seemed to come from a different direction, making it impossible to tell where the danger lay. Branches tore at their clothes, roots seemed to reach up, trying to trip them, to pull them into the earth itself. Taylor, leading the group, skid to a stop. "Wait," he gasped. "Listen." The others paused, their breath ragged. The voices had stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of their frantic breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, from deep within the trees, a single voice called out. It was Ethan's. "Help me." Samantha's heart froze. "That's impossible. He's... Taylor shook his head. "No, we have to keep moving." But as they turned to leave, something stepped out from the trees. It was Ethan, or at least something that looked like him. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and stretched, his lips curled into a haunting smile. "You didn't listen," he whispered, his voice an unnatural echo. "Now the forest will keep you too." The group screamed, but there was no escape. The shadows closed in, the forest swallowing their cries. The next morning the campsite was empty. The fire was cold, the tents abandoned. No trace of the campers remained, except for the whispers that now haunted the forest, calling out for the next to follow. That's how the legend goes, at least. So if you ever hear your name whispered from the trees, you know what to do. Run. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just 4 friends, a campfire, and a couple of tents in the middle of nowhere. Ravens Creek was an abandoned campsite, forgotten after a string of disappearances years ago. The locals avoided it, but for Nate, Jess, Aaron, and Katie, that only made it more appealing. They arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun dripped low behind the dense trees, casting long shadows that crept toward them like fingers reaching from the forest. The air was colder than they expected, a sharp chill that made Katie shiver despite her thick jacket. "Perfect spot, right?" Nate grinned, his eyes shining with excitement. Jess, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes but smiled. Aaron unpacked their gear, trying not to notice the uneasy look on Katie's face. As the sun set, they gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing, the crackling flames casting flickering light on their faces. But as the night grew darker, something fell off. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, had faded into an unsettling silence. "Anyone else hear that?" Katie whispered, her voice barely above a whisper over the fire. But everyone froze. "Hear what?" Nate asked, glancing around as his smile faded. "Nothing. That's the problem," she replied, eyes wide. Aaron shrugged. "Maybe the animals just don't like the fire. No big deal." But it didn't feel right. The silence pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. Jess stood up, shining her flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but it was as if the trees swallowed the light. "I'm getting a weird feeling about this place," Jess muttered. "You're just freaked out because of the stories," Nate said, trying to keep the mood light, but even he was starting to feel the weight of the quiet. Then they heard it, a distant voice, barely more than a whisper, coming from deep in the woods. It was faint, but unmistakably someone calling for help. Katie's face paled. What the hell was that? "Probably just some other campers messing with us," Nate said, though his voice wavered. No one else is here, Jess shot back. We're miles away from anyone. The voice called again, closer this time. It was a soft, desperate plea that seemed to come from all directions. Aaron stood up, squinting into the darkness. Maybe we should check it out. What if someone's hurt? Are you insane? Katie hissed. That doesn't sound like someone who needs help. It sounds wrong. Despite her warning, Aaron grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward the sound. Nate and Jess hesitated before following. Katie stayed by the fire, heart racing, watching as her friends disappeared into the forest. Minutes passed, the fire cracked softly, its warmth doing nothing to soothe her nerves. The darkness seemed to close in, and the trees, once distant, now loomed closer, their branches twisting like claws. Then from the forest a scream tore through the silence, a blood-curdling cry that sent shivers down Katie's spine. She jumped to her feet, panic surging through her. Nate, Jess, Aaron, she shouted, her voice shaking, but there was no response, only the scream echoing in the distance, followed by a sickening silence. She ran into the woods, flashlight shaking in her hand, the beam blurrily penetrating the thick fog that seemed to rise from the ground. Swirling around her legs, her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over roots and rocks, calling out for her friends. Suddenly she found Jess, standing completely still, staring at something in front of her. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Jess, what happened? Where are the others? Katie gasped, grabbing her arm. Jess slowly turned, her voice barely a whisper. They're gone. The camp, it's gone. Katie followed her gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. Where the camp had been, where the fire, tents, and all their gear should have been, there was nothing, just an empty clearing, as if they had never been there at all. The fire was gone, the tents, everything. Katie's breath hitched as the eerie silence pressed down on them. This isn't possible, she whispered. We were just there. A voice, a whisper, cold and unnerving, came from behind them. You were never here. Katie spun around, but there was no one. The fog thickened, twisting around them like a living thing. The trees seemed to shift, their branches creaking, closing in. We need to get out of here, Katie urged, grabbing Jess's arm. But Jess didn't move. She just stared ahead, eyes wide with fear. Katie, Jess breathed, her voice trembling. Look. Katie turned, her heart nearly stopping. Emerging from the fog were shadows, figures, barely visible but unmistakably human. Their faces were blank, their forms twisted and wrong. They drifted toward them, silent, but filled with an evil presence. We have to run, Katie screamed, yanking Jess with her. But as they turned to flee, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, pulling them back toward the camp that no longer existed. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them. And then, just like that, everything went silent again. The next morning, a search party found nothing at Ravens Creek. No signs of a campfire, no footprints, and no trace of 4 friends. The camp had vanished just like the others before them. All that was left was the silence and the whispers of those who had disappeared into the night. They heard about the old campsite for years. Locals called it Devil's Hollow, a place no one dared visit anymore. Sama, Emma, Jake, Lily had grown up hearing the stories, campers disappearing without a trace, strange noises at night, and whispers of cursed land. But like most teenagers, they didn't believe it. They wanted to prove that legends were just that, stories. We'll be fine, Jake said, leading the group into the woods. It's just a bunch of old rumors to keep people away. We'll camp for the night, make some memories, and head back in the morning. The trail was overgrown and the trees were thick, their twisted branches blocking out most of the afternoon sunlight. The deeper they went, the colder the air seemed to get. Emma hugged herself tightly, glancing around. This place feels wrong, she muttered, her breath visible in the air. I swear it was warmer back at the car. You're just scared, Sam teased, but even he sounded uneasy. They had all expected to laugh at the spooky stories, but there was an unsettling quiet in these woods. No birds, no insects, just the wind whispering through the trees. By the time they reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The campsite was wide, flat space surrounded by tall pines, with remnants of old campfires and rotting benches scattered around, but there was something eerie about the place, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Everything felt frozen in time. Jake dumped his backpack on the ground. See, just a regular campsite. Let's get the fire going. They set up their tents quickly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over them. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The once still air grew heavier, colder. The fire cracked, but the warmth seemed weak, unable to push back the creeping chill. Emma stared into the flames, barely hearing her friend's conversation. Her mind kept drifting back to the woods. The trees felt like they were watching, their branches reaching out like claws. You okay, Lily asked, noticing Emma's distant look. Emma nodded, though her stomach turning with uneasiness. It feels like we're not alone. Lily laughed nervously, but the laughter didn't last. The fire flickered, casting long shadows around the campsite, and then the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakably voices. Just beyond the circle of light, they were soft, urgent, like someone calling for help far away. Did you hear that? Sam asked, suddenly alert. Everyone froze, listening. The whispers grew louder. Though they couldn't make out the words, it was like dozens of voices were speaking all at once, overlapping, coming closer. Jake grabbed a flashlight, his expression serious now. Who's out there? Is someone messing with us? He shined the light into the woods, but the beam barely cut through the thick trees. The whispers stopped for a moment, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Then a branch snapped, loud, close, too close. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. We need to leave, she whispered. This isn't right. Jake, trying to be brave, took a step toward the woods. We can't just freak out. Maybe someone's out here, lost. We should check it out. But before he could move, a low groan echoed from the forest. It wasn't human. It was deep, and it growled and sent shivers down their spines. Suddenly something moved in the darkness, a shape, just beyond the firelight, too fast to see clearly. It darted between the trees, circling them. The whispers returned, louder, angrier now. The air grew colder, freezing. Their breaths came out in panicked gasps, the fire struggling to stay lit. We have to get out of here, Emma screamed, grabbing her backpack. The others followed her lead, snatching up their gear in a blind rush. But as they started to run, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching down as if alive. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the forest, bouncing off the trees. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from. Lily stumbled, her foot catching on a root. Sam grabbed her arm, pulling her up, but as they turned, they saw it. Something in the woods, a figure tall and twisted, standing impossibly still, just at the edge of the clearing. Its face was wrong, blank, pale, like it wasn't fully human. It didn't move, but they could feel its eyes on them watching. What is that? Lily's voice trembled, barely a whisper. We're not waiting to find out, Jake said, his voice shaking. He tugged them forward, deeper into the trees, away from the clearing. But no matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more desperate. Jake, Emma screamed, pointing ahead. Just in front of them, in the middle of the trail, was another figure. This one was smaller, hunched over like it had been waiting for them. Its head twitched unnaturally, turning to look at them with empty, hollowed eyes. Run, Sam shouted, pulling Emma back. They veered off the path, crashing through the underbush, hearts pounding in their chests. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their legs burned from running, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Finally, they burst through the trees, back to the clearing, but when they looked around, their hearts sunk. The campsite was gone. What the? Where are we? Jake gasped, his flashlight flickering as the battery started to die. The clearing looked different, wrong. The fire pit was gone and the benches were rotted almost like they had been sitting there for decades. There was no sign of their tents, no sign they had ever been there at all. We're trapped, Emma whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The figures appeared again, one by one, surrounding them. They moved slowly, almost guiding through the air, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and sorrow. We have to go, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was nowhere to run. The trees seemed to close in, the figures getting closer. And then, just like that, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the figures faded into the shadows, and the air grew still. But they knew the truth. They were never leaving Devil's Hollow. The campsite hadn't been forgotten. They had. The next morning, the search party found no trace of the 4 campers, just like the others before them. They were gone, lost to the echoes of the past. They never should have gone off the map. Everyone in town said Blackwood Forest was cursed. But to Sam, Laura, Nick, and Rachel, it was just another place to explore. They'd been planning the weekend camping trip for months. Just the 4 of them, no cell phones, and no distractions. The trail they were supposed to follow was well marked, but Nick was always eager for adventure. About an hour into the hike, he spotted an old, overgrown path veering off to the right. "This isn't on the map," Nick said, flashing his adventurous grin. "Want to check it out?" "I don't know," Rachel said, looking uneasy. "They say people get lost out here." "Come on," Nick urged, already stepping onto the forgotten trail. "What's the worst that could happen? We're not going far." Sam and Laura exchanged glances, but they followed, Rachel hesitant, but she couldn't be left behind. They didn't know it yet, but this decision was a mistake. The deeper they ventured into the Blackwood Forest, the darker it became. The thick canopy of trees blocked out most of the daylight, and the air felt heavier, colder. A natural quiet settled over the group. No birds, no wind, just the sound of their footsteps crunching leaves and breaking twigs. Rachel spoke first, her voice small and shaky. "Guys, this doesn't feel right." Sam, the logical one, stopped and pulled out his compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. He frowned and tapped it, but it didn't help. "That's weird. I think we should head back." Nick chuckled, trying to shake off the growing tension. "It's just the trees messing with it. Let's keep going. We'll find something cool, I bet." But with each step, the forest seemed to close in tighter around them. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path grew smaller, more suffocating. Laura kept looking over her shoulder, sure she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing, just shadows. "We should have stayed on the marked trail," Rachel muttered. Her voice trembled. She could feel it, something wasn't right. Suddenly there was a sound, a faint, distant whisper, carried on the wind. It was so soft at first no one was sure if they heard it at all. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice tight. Nick stopped and listened, a frown seizing his brow. "Hear what?" Then they all heard it, a soft, breathy voice, so quiet it barely cut through the air. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep in the forest, just beyond their line of sight. "Help!" It was a whisper, but it chilled them to the bone. Rachel's heart raced, her hands shaking. That's not funny. Someone's out there. Maybe someone's lost," Sam said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We should go back," Laura insisted, her eyes darting nervously around the darkening forest. We're not alone out here. Nick, the adventurer, was already walking toward the voice. We can't just leave if someone's in trouble. Sam followed, and with no choice, Laura and Rachel went too. The whisper continued, but it didn't get louder. It seemed to move, drifting through the trees, always just out of reach. This way. The deeper they went, the more twisted the trees became. The trail seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the dense forest. The sun was low now, barely visible, through the canopy, casting everything in a strange dim light. Then just ahead they saw it, an old crumbling cabin. Its roof sagged, the wood was rotted, and vines had swallowed most of it. It looked abandoned for years. Let's check it out, Nick said, stepping forward, but Rachel grabbed his arm. No, we need to turn back now. Nick hesitated, but Sam nodded. Rachel's right, this is wrong. The voice is leading us somewhere, and I don't think we want to find out where. Just as they turned to leave, the whisper returned, this time louder, more insistent. Don't leave. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. The air grew colder and the trees seemed to shift, blocking the way they came. Panic surged through them. We're lost, Laura gasped, spinning around. Where's the trail? Sam grabbed his compass again, but the needle was still spinning wildly. This doesn't make sense. Then the shadows started moving. Dark shapes filtered between the trees, just out of sight. But there, watching, Rachel backed up, her breath quickening. We need to run. The group broke into a sprint, dodging low branches and roots, but no matter which way they ran, the forest seemed to shift around them, leading them back to the same spot, the old cabin. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them. Stay with us. Stop, Rachel screamed, her voice cracking. Leave us alone. Suddenly the forest went silent, no whispers, no movement, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. They stood in front of the cabin, panting, hearts racing as the cold air wrapped around them like a shroud. What the hell is going on? Nick muttered, his face pale. We need to get out of here, Laura said, her voice barely a whisper. There's something wrong with this place. But as they turned to leave, the door of the cabin creaked open on its own. The inside was dark, pitch black, but someone, stood in the doorway. A figure tall and thin, its features covered by shadow. It spoke, but its voice wasn't human. It was deep and distorted, like 100 voices speaking at once. You came to us, it said, its voice rattling the air. You can never leave. The ground beneath them shifted, and the trees groaned as if alive. The whispers returned louder than ever, surrounding them from all sides. Sam grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her away. Run now, but the forest wasn't letting them go. As they sprinted, the shadows chased them, growing, stretching, becoming shapes, human shapes, twisted and rawled. The whispers were no longer distant. They were in their ears, in their mind. Your heirs. Rachel tripped, falling hard to the ground. Sam and Laura stopped to help her, but Nick froze, staring at something behind them. Nick, come on, Sam shouted, but Nick didn't move. His eyes were wide, his face drained of color. Slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed. Behind them, the figure from the cabin was there, closer now. Its face was a pale, emotionless mask, and it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures stood behind it, silent, waiting. We can't escape, Nick whispered, his voice hollow. Sam grabbed him, yanking him into motion. We have to try. They ran again, but no matter which way they went, the forest led them in circles. The shadows closed in, and the whispers became screams, angry and sorrowful screams. Finally, they burst through a clearing, stumbling out of the trees. The sunlight hit them like a wave, warm and real. They gasped for air, looking back at the forest. The trees stood still, the shadows gone, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers echoed in their ears, fading slowly. We'll be waiting. They never spoke about the night again, and they never, ever returned to Blackwood Forest. Some places should stay forgotten. The lost trail had taken them, And though they escaped, part of them remained, trapped forever in the shadows of Blackwood Forest. They never believed the stories about Dreadwood Forest. Ethan, Sarah, Mark, and Jenny were used to local legends about haunted woods and cursed land. Dreadwood, with its reputation for strange disappearances and eerie occurrences, sounded like the perfect place for a weekend camping trip. Plus, the blood moon that was set to rise that night only added to the thrill. This is going to be epic, Ethan said as they unloaded their gear at the edge of the forest. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. The path ahead was narrow and overgrown, the forest darker than any of them expected. Sarah hesitated, her eyes scanning the thick woods. It looks different from the photos online, she muttered. Are we sure this is a good idea? Mark, the fearless one, slung his backpack over his shoulder and grinned. Come on, it's just a forest. Let's get to the campsite before dark. The group hiked into Dreadwood, the air growing colder as the sun sunk lower. The trees seemed unnaturally close, their branches tangled together above like skeletal fingers, blocking out the fading daylight. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of their boots crunching the dry underbrush. I don't like how quiet it is, Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, gripping the straps of her backpack. Yeah, it's weird, something's off. Ethan shrugged it off, though even he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling creeping over him. It's just because it's isolated. We're miles from town. After what felt like an hour of walking, they found a clearing in open space, surrounded by tall, dense trees, the perfect spot to set up camp, but something about it felt wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. The air was still, too still, as if the forest was holding its breath. They set up the tents quickly as the light faded. By the time the fire was going, the first glimpse of the blood moon appeared over the horizon. It was larger than they expected, glowing a deep unsettling red, casting long shadows across the clearing. Look at that, Mark said, pointing. It's amazing. But Jenny's eyes never left the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like silent watchers, and the shadows beneath them seemed to stretch and move. I don't like this, she whispered. The moon, it doesn't feel right. Ethan laughed nervously. It's just the moon. Jenny, it can't hurt us. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her, staring up at the glowing orb. It's more than that. This place feels wrong. Suddenly a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, like a branch snapping under pressure. Everyone froze, staring into the dark woods. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes in the trees. What was that? Sarah whispered. Probably just an animal, Mark said, though his voice lacked confidence. Another crack, louder this time, followed by a low, almost growly groan. The sound was faint, but unmistakably unnatural. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, hidden in the shadows between the trees. Jenny stood up, her face pale. We need to leave. Before anyone could argue, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, standing perfectly still among the trees, its shape blurred by the shifting shadows. Ethan's heart raced as he stood up, grabbing the flashlight. Who's there? The figure didn't move. Hey, Mark shouted, stepping forward. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. But as the beam of the flashlight swept over the trees, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Sarah gasped. Did you see that? We're not alone out here, Jenny whispered, backing away from the edge of the clearing. Ethan turned in a slow circle, shining the light into the woods, but there was nothing, just darkness, thick and impenetrable. The eerie silence returned, even more oppressive than before. Suddenly the fire sputtered and dimmed, as if the cold air had sucked the life out of it. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the air. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. Mark, trying to stay calm, grabbed his backpack. We'll head back to the car. It's not that far. But as they packed up their things, the whispers begun. At first it was faint like the wind brushing through the leaves. But as they stood still, it grew louder. Low, disjointed voices echoing through the trees. The words were impossible to understand, but the tone was clear. They were being watched. Jenny's hand shook as she drew her backpack on. We shouldn't have come up here. We need to leave now. The group hurriedly started down the path they came from, but the forest felt different. The trail, once clear, was now hidden by shadows. The trees seemed to shift in the moonlight, their branches twisting and moving like they were alive. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. Keep moving, Ethan urged, though panic was raising in his chest. As they ran, the shadows seemed to close in, the whispers now surrounding them, filling their heads with murmurs. The blood moon glowed overhead, bathing the forest in its red light, casting long, eerie shadows. Suddenly Sarah screamed. They all stopped, turning to see her standing still, staring at something ahead. In the middle of the trail stood the figure again, closer this time. Its face was hidden, its body tall and distorted in the moonlight. Behind it, more shapes appeared, shadowy figures barely visible, but definitely there, watching, waiting. We're trapped, Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. They're everywhere. The figures didn't move, but the oppressive feeling of being hunted grew stronger. The whispers became louder, swirling around them, overlapping as if shadows themselves were speaking. Ethan grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her forward. We have to go around. There's another way out. But the moment they stepped off the path, the forest seemed to come alive. The branches reached down like claws, snagging their clothes, their backpacks, pulling them back toward the trail. The shadows moved, closing in on all sides. They won't let us leave, Mark gasped, his breath ragged. Jenny was crying now, her eyes wide with terror. We have to try. With a final burst of energy, they pushed through the underbush, ignoring the branches tearing at their skin, ignoring the whispers that filled their heads. No matter how far they ran, the forest seemed endless. The figures were always just behind them, shadows that flickered in the corners of their vision. Finally, they burst out of the trees, stumbling onto the road. The car was there, just where they had left it. Without a word, they drew open the doors and scrambled inside. Hearts pounding, bodies trembling. Ethan jammed the key into the ignition, his hand shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to start the car. As they sped down the road, no one looked back. The blood moon hung low in the sky, watching as they fled. They never spoke about what happened in Dreadwood Forest, but every time the moon turned red, they remembered the shadows. They remembered the whispers, and they knew that something still waited for them in the dark. The blood moon had risen, and Dreadwood Forest would never let them forget what they had seen. It started like any normal camping trip. Jason, Liz, Mike, and Rachel had planned a weekend getaway for weeks. They wanted to escape the busy city, disconnect from their phones, and spend a few nights deep in Blackwood Forest. The locals, of course, warned them about the forest's strange history. People had gone missing over the years, strange sounds had been heard at night, and some said the forest was alive, hungry. But the 4 friends laughed it off. They were seasoned campers. After all, a few spooky stories couldn't scare them. They would pack their gear, load into Jason's car, and set off, excited for a weekend adventure. The forest was dense, darker than they expected, even the late afternoon sun. As they parked and hiked down the narrow, overgrown trail, the trees seemed to close in, their thick branches blocking out the sky. The air was still, heavy, as if the forest was watching them. Man, this place is creepy, Liz said, glancing around. It's too quiet. Mike smirked. Just your imagination. We'll be fine once the fire's going. Rachel, always the cautious one, looked back at the path they had just come from. I don't know, guys. Maybe we should have camped closer to the main trail. This place feels wrong. But Jason, the fearless leader, shrugged it off. Relax. We've camped in creepier places. Let's just set up camp before it gets dark. They found a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches twisted like claws reaching toward the sky. It was perfect, or so they thought. They quickly set up their tents, built a fire, and started to relax as the sun sunk lower. The sky turned down a dark, burning orange, and the forest shadows grew longer, stretching out toward them. As they sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes, the night grew colder, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. That's when they first heard it, a distant rustling sound, like something large moving through the trees. What was that? Rachel asked, sitting up straighter, her eyes wide. Jason laughed, though there was an edge to it. Probably a deer or something. It's a forest, remember? But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, closer, as if whatever was out there was circling their camp. The firelight barely reached the edges of the trees, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. Liz stood up, shining her flashlight into the dark. Okay, seriously, what is that? It sounds huge. They all fell silent, listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, and the stillness was worse. It was as if the entire forest had froze, holding its breath. Then from deep within the woods came a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't an animal. It sounded too deep. Rachel's voice trembled. That's not a deer. The fire crackled, but it wasn't comforting anymore. The darkness beyond it felt alive, pressing in from all sides. The growling stopped, but the forest seemed to shift, the shadows moving closer, darker than before. We need to leave, Rachel said, standing quickly. I don't care what that was. We're not safe here. Jason looked hesitant, but nodded. All right, let's pack up. Maybe we'll camp closer to the main trail. But before they could move, the ground beneath them shuddered. A tree branch snapped loudly, and suddenly the rustling started again. This time faster, like something huge was charging, drew the trees toward them. Run, Jason shouted. They bolted, leaving their tents and gear behind. The sound of branches breaking and leaves crunching grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one thing chasing them. It sounded like the entire forest was alive, moving, hunting. Liz screamed, tripping over a root, but Mike grabbed her arm, yanking her up as they raced through the dark woods. The flashlight beams bounced wildly, barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. We're going the wrong way, Rachel cried, her voice panicked. We need to get back to the car. But the forest had changed. The trail they had come down earlier was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The trees seemed to shift, closing in on them, twisting together in unnatural shapes. The rustling sound was all around them now, surrounding them. Something was stalking them, moving through the trees faster than they could run. Mike stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight into the dark woods. What is that? Just ahead, something moved between the trees, a shadow tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements too fast. It darted between the trunks, disappearing before they could get a clear look. Keep going, Jason shouted, pushing them forward. But the forest wasn't letting them go. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches snagging at their clothes, slowing them down. The air grew colder, thick with a damp, rotten smell that made them gag. Liz's breath came in ragged gasps. It's following us, I can feel it. They ran harder, but no matter how far they went, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The whispers began next, faint at first like the wind rustling the leaves, but growing louder with every step. The voices were low, insistent, like they were being called deeper into the woods. Don't listen to it, Rachel cried, her voice shaking. Just keep moving. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, filling their heads. The trees twisted and shifted in the dark, their shadows stretching toward them like hands. The thing that had been stalking them was closer now, moving just at the edge of the flashlight beams. Suddenly, Jason stopped dead in his tracks. Guys, look. They all turned to where he was pointing. Just ahead through the thick trees was a clearing, but it wasn't empty. In the center stood a massive tree larger than any they had seen. Its bark was black and twisted, and its roots curled up from the ground like claws. Hanging from the branches were bones, human bones, tied with old frayed ropes. Skulls, rib cages, and limbs swayed gently in the air, creaking as they moved. "Oh my God," Liz whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "What is this?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath the massive tree shifted, and from the darkness behind it, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body blending with the shadows. Its face was pale, hollow, with empty, soulless eyes. It reached out with long, bony fingers, beckoning them closer. "We have to go," Mike shouted, pulling at Jason's arm, but it was too late. The forest had them now. The shadows moved faster, the whispers louder, and the thing, whatever it was, came for them. They ran, but the trees closed in, the branches wrapping around them like a living trap. The last thing they saw was the figure stepping out of the shadows, its empty eyes watching as the forest claimed them. By morning, there was no trace of the four friends. The campsite was empty, the tents undisturbed, but their footprints vanished into the forest, never to be found. Blackwood Forest had fed, and the forest always hungered for more.